A man rode 15 hours in the saddle today. He crossed 2 rivers, lost a steer to a rattlesnake bite, and slept 4 hours on hard ground. Tomorrow he does it again, for 3 months straight, and the only thing standing between him and collapse is a cook named Cookie, and a wooden box on wheels loaded with dried beans, salt pork, a sourdough crock, and a bag of Arbuckle's coffee. No supplements, no protein bars, no nutritionist, just food. Real food. Food that worked. This is what they ate. Number 30. Sourdough biscuits. The crock rode in the Chuckwagon like a passenger, wrapped in cloth, packed away from the heat, protected from the dust that coated everything else on the Chisholm Trail. Cookie's sourdough starter was sometimes older than he was. Men have written in trail diaries from the 1880s that Cookie would sooner lose a wheel than lose that crock. Because without it, there was no bread, and without bread, there was nothing. Every morning before first light he was already at it. Flour, lard, a scoop of starter, a little water, worked fast with cold hands, pressed into rounds, into the Dutch oven. Coals underneath, coals on the lid. 18 minutes and the smell of baking bread rolled across the camp and woke men faster than any alarm. A biscuit cost about 1 cent to make. It fed a man for an hour of the hardest riding of his life. Grandma just called it bread. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 29. Sonofabich stew. That was its name. The Cowboys named it, and they meant it as a compliment, when a calf was slaughtered on the drive, which happened when an animal was injured or too weak to continue. Cookie took everything: tongue, heart, liver, kidneys, the marrow gut, which is the tube connecting a calf's stomachs, still partially filled with partially digested milk. That went into the Dutch oven with water, wild onion if Cookie could find it, black pepper, salt, a handful of dried chili, cooked low for 2 hours until the broth turned dark and thick and the organ meat softened into something almost silky. This was not poverty food. This was the celebration meal. You ate Sonofabich stew when the drive had a good day. The whole crew gathered, 10 plates filled. Nothing, not one piece of that animal, went to the ground. They knew things about using an animal that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 28. Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee. Every cattle drive in the American West ran on it. John Arbuckle began selling pre-roasted, pre-ground coffee coated in a sugar and egg glaze in 1865. The glaze preserved the roast during the long haul from New York to Texas. Before Arbuckle's, Cowboys roasted green beans themselves in a pan over the fire every morning. Arbuckle's eliminated that step and became the standard issue coffee of the cattle drive era almost overnight. 15 cents a pound. Cookie brewed it black and strong enough to float a horseshoe, as the saying went. Cowboys who rode the night herd drank it cold from a tin cup in the dark. Cowboys on the trail chewed the whole beans to stay awake in the saddle. Today we call it Cowboy coffee and sell it as a premium product at $18 a bag with a logo of a man on a horse. The cowboys who actually drank it earned $25 a month. The coffee cost 15 cents. Nobody's selling that story on the bag. Number 27. Lard and biscuit. There was no butter on the cattle drive. Butter spoiled in 2 days in the Texas heat. What Cookie had was lard, rendered pig fat, packed into a tin stable in heat, almost indefinitely shelf-stable in the dry trail air. He put it on the table, or rather, the tailgate of the Chuckwagon. Every morning next to the biscuits, a cowboy split his biscuit open while it was still steaming, pressed a thumb-sized scoop of lard into the center, and ate it in 3 bites before the lard had fully melted. 1 tablespoon of lard delivered 120 calories. Men in the saddle burned somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day. The math required lard. There was no substitute. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Lard has less saturated fat per tablespoon than butter, and it contains oleic acid, the same heart-healthy fat found in olive oil. They spent 40 years telling you it would kill you. The cowboys who ate it daily rode 1,000 miles and lived to tell it. Number 26. The dried bean pot, 2 to 3 cents a pound. That was the cost of the backbone of every cattle drive that ever crossed the American plains. Pinto beans, sometimes black beans along the Texas-Mexico border routes. Cookie soaked them overnight in the water barrel, then set the Dutch oven going at first light with salt pork cut into thick chunks, a dried chili or two, and enough water to cover everything by 4 inches. They cooked all day, slow. The wagon moved, the fire died to coals. Cookie rebuilt it at the noon stop, and by supper the beans had broken down into a thick, dark, smoky pot that smelled like something you wanted to sit down in front of and not move for an hour. Fed 12 men. Cost maybe 30 cents total. Every trail boss on every major drive from the 1860s through the 1890s, Chisholm, goodnight-loving Western Trail, carried beans as the primary protein source. Not beef, beans. The herd was the paycheck. You didn't eat the paycheck unless you had to. Number 25. Son of a gun in a sack. The Cowboys had a naming system. If something was difficult, dangerous, or surprising, it got a name that reflected exactly that. This was the dessert that showed up when Cookie felt generous, when the drive had covered good miles, when morale needed something sweet. Suet, raw beef fat trimmed from around the kidneys, mixed with flour, dried apples or raisins when Cookie had them, a pour of molasses, a pinch of salt. The whole mixture wrapped tight in a cloth sack, tied at the top, and submerged in a pot of boiling water for 2 hours over the campfire. When it came out, Cookie untied the sack and turned it onto the tailgate. It held its shape like a dark, dense pudding. Cut into portions with a knife. Eaten warm with a spoon or just with 2 fingers. 5 cents worth of ingredients. The only dessert most cowboys saw between Texas and Kansas. Some trail diaries record men going quiet when it appeared. That kind of quiet, that means something. Number 24. Chili con carne, the original no beans. That is important. The original trail chili contained no beans. Beans were a separate pot, a separate meal. Chili was dried beef or jerky, pounded and shredded, cooked down with dried chili peppers, lard, wild oregano, and garlic when Cookie could find it. The mixture was pressed and dried into hard, dark bricks, what some called chili bricks, that cowboys carried in their saddlebags. On the trail, a man snapped off a piece of chili brick, dropped it into a tin cup of hot water, and had a hot meal without stopping the herd. The whole cup cost about 4 cents. It weighed almost nothing. It kept a man going for 4 hours in the saddle. Today, the canned chili industry is worth $1.1 billion. Conagra, Hormel, and a dozen other corporations spent the 20th century turning a 4-cent dried brick into a product that costs $2 a can and contains enough sodium to cure a hide. That is not progress. That is a 4-cent idea that got very expensive for you. Number 23. Cornmeal mush. 3 cents a pound for cornmeal in the 1870s. Cookie made it stretch across 2 meals without blinking. At breakfast, he stirred cornmeal into boiling water with a wooden spoon and a pinch of salt, cooked it until it thickened into something between porridge and paste, and ladled it into tin bowls. Eaten hot with molasses drizzled over the top. What was left in the pot? And Cookie always made sure something was left. He poured into a flat pan and set aside. By noon it had cooled and firmed into sliceable slabs. Those slabs went into the lard tin, fried hard on each side until they were gold and crisp at the edges and soft in the middle, eaten cold or warm from a saddlebag. 1 cooking. 2 meals. 12 men. Today we call it polenta, and charge $14 a plate in Italian restaurants in cities where nobody has ever ridden a horse. Cookie charged nothing. He just made sure nobody went hungry. Number 22. Fried salt pork and gravy. The salt pork came out of the barrel in thick slabs, white and dense and smelling of brine. Cookie sliced it and laid it in the Dutch oven, and the fat immediately began to render, spitting and hissing in the cast iron, turning the pieces first translucent, then golden, then dark at the edges. He pulled the meat and left the fat. Into that fat went flour, stirred fast before it burned, then water, or sometimes the bean pot liquid if he had it. The flour absorbed the fat and the liquid, and the whole thing became something darker and silkier than any cream gravy you have ever bought in a jar. Poured over split biscuits until the biscuits disappeared under it entirely. On some drives along the Texas Panhandle, the Cowboys called this Texas butter. Not as a joke, as a statement of fact. This was what butter was when butter wasn't available. It cost 4 cents a pound for the pork and nothing for the grease it left behind. Nothing wasted. Not one drop. Number 21. Dried apple pie. Cookie made it on Friday nights when the drive had gone well. It was a signal. A Friday pie meant the week had been good. No stampedes, no injuries. Good water at the last creek, the herd moving steady. The men knew what it meant when they smelled apples. Dried apple slices soaked in water for an hour until they softened and swelled, then cooked in the Dutch oven with sugar, cinnamon, and a little vinegar to sharpen the sweetness. A biscuit dough pressed thin across the top as a crust. Coals under the oven, coals piled on the lid. 25 minutes. The crust came out pale gold and slightly cracked at the edges where the apple filling had bubbled through. Cookie cut it in the pan with his knife and served it directly. No plates. Men held their portion in their hand and ate it standing up around the fire. 5 cents worth of dried apples and flour and sugar, and something that cannot be priced. The understanding that the man cooking your food cared whether you had something worth eating at the end of a hard week. Pull back for a moment. Charles Goodnight built the first Chuckwagon in 1866 from a surplus Civil War Studebaker wagon. He added the chuck box, a hinged cabinet bolted to the back, divided into compartments for food, tools, medicine, and the sourdough crock. He designed it himself. No company built it for him. No corporation supplied it. One rancher, one carpenter, one idea, and it became the mobile kitchen that fed the entire cattle drive era of the American West. The cook, Cookie, was the second highest paid man on any drive. Higher than the Wranglers, higher than the Ropers, higher than most of the Cowboys who had been riding longer than he had been cooking. A trail boss earned $60 a month. Cookie earned $50. A cowboy earned $25. The math tells you exactly how much feeding men mattered. By the 1950s, that math had been rewritten. Industrial feedlots replaced trail culture. The meatpacking industry, led by Swift, Armour, and Wilson, the big four packers, who by 1920 already controlled 60% of American meat processing, had no use for Chuckwagon knowledge. They needed consumers, not cooks. They needed people who bought things in cans, not people who knew how to make a 4-cent chili brick last 3 days in a saddlebag. The knowledge didn't disappear on its own. There was a reason it disappeared. And the reason had a profit margin. Number 20. Vinegar pie, no fruit, no cream, no lemon. Just eggs, sugar, flour, butter when Cookie had it, or lard when he didn't, and apple cider vinegar. Mixed together into a smooth custard and poured into a biscuit dough crust. Baked in the Dutch oven with coals on the lid until the center set firm and the top turned the color of old honey. It tasted like lemon pie. Exactly like lemon pie. Cowboys who had never eaten a lemon in their lives asked Cookie what fruit he used. He told them vinegar. They didn't believe him. He stopped explaining 3 cents worth of ingredients, and here is what nobody told them. Apple cider vinegar contains acetic acid, which research now shows supports healthy digestion and helps regulate blood sugar response after high-carbohydrate meals. Men eating biscuits and cornmeal 3 times a day on a cattle drive needed exactly that. Cookie didn't have a clinical word for it. He just knew that the men who ate his vinegar pie felt better after dinner than the men who didn't. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 20. Canned sardines on toast, 49 cents a can in Detroit in 1985. King Oscar, Brunswick, whatever was on the bottom shelf. Drained, laid flat on 2 slices of toast, a little hot sauce if he had it, raw onion if he didn't. He ate it standing at the counter or sitting at a small table near the window. Dinner in under 5 minutes. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. A single can of sardines in 1985 delivered more omega-3 fatty acids, more calcium, more B12 than almost any other food in that grocery store at any price. The bones were soft enough to eat. He ate them. They were good for him in ways that took nutritional science another 20 years to fully confirm. Grandma just called it fish night. She was right. Number 19. Cornmeal mush with butter. Cornmeal cost 22 cents a pound in rural Ohio in 1982. A pound made enough mush to fill a man twice over and have some left to slice cold and fry in the morning. Brought the water to a boil, salted, always salted first, and poured the cornmeal in slow, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon so it wouldn't lump. You couldn't rush it. The mush told you when it was ready. It pulled away from the sides of the pot, thickened into something that moved like slow lava, and the whole kitchen filled with a smell like warm grain and wet earth and something older than the apartment, older than the city. A pat of butter melted into the center. Sometimes a pour of cold milk around the edge of the bowl. Nothing else needed. This was Depression-era food making its second run through an American kitchen. His mother had eaten this in the 1930s in southeastern Indiana when there was nothing else. He was eating it in 1983 for the same reason, not because options didn't exist, but because it was warm and filling and cost almost nothing, and he knew exactly how to make it correctly. Today they put it in a copper pot, call it polenta, and charge $14 a bowl in Columbus restaurants. The recipe hasn't changed by a single ingredient. Only the address changed. Only who's allowed to feel good about eating it changed. Number 18. Liver and onions. Beef liver. 59 cents a pound at the butcher counter in Pittsburgh in 1984. The butcher always had it. Nobody else was buying it by then. The American palate had already begun its long retreat from anything that tasted like it came from an actual animal. He sliced it thin, dredged it in flour seasoned with salt and pepper, and laid it into a screaming hot cast-iron pan with a spoonful of lard. The sound it made when it hit the pan was serious. A hard sizzle that filled the kitchen immediately. 2 minutes per side, no more. Or it went tough and bitter and lost everything that made it worth eating. While it rested, onions went into the same fat over low heat, slow, until they collapsed into something golden and sweet that smelled like caramel and made you forget you'd been skeptical. Everything plated together. The liver dark and crusted on the outside, still faintly pink within. The onions draped over the top. A half-pound of beef liver in 1984 delivered more iron than a dozen spinach salads, more B12 than a week's worth of eggs, more zinc than most cuts of steak at 3 times the price. The nutritional density per penny was almost unmatched anywhere in that butcher case. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Processed food companies and the restaurant industry spent the 1970s and 1980s systematically repositioning organ meats as low class, undesirable, something a person with options wouldn't eat. It worked. Liver consumption in the United States dropped nearly 60% between 1970 and 1990. They didn't stumble into that result. They engineered it, because cheap, nutritionally complete food that people make at home is bad for quarterly earnings. He kept making it. He knew what it was worth. Number 17. Soup beans, not chili. Not stew. Not bean soup in the way that phrase implies something thin and refined and served in a white bowl at a restaurant. Soup beans. That's what they called it in the Appalachian communities of eastern Ohio and the West Virginia steel towns. The men who had come north to work the mills in the 1950s and brought their food language with them like luggage. Pinto beans, dry 35 cents a pound, soaked overnight, cooked low and long the next day with a piece of fatback or a ham bone, or sometimes nothing at all except water and salt, and the patience to let them go for 3 hours until they broke down into something thick and almost creamy, the liquid indistinguishable from the beans themselves, eaten in a bowl, sometimes with cornbread, sometimes just alone with a spoon and the television on low in the other room. In the coalfields and steel towns of Appalachian Ohio, soup beans were not a side dish. They were the meal. They had been the meal for 3 generations before the mills, and would be the meal for 3 generations after. The men who retired in the 1980s on fixed incomes didn't think of this as hardship food. They thought of it as home food. The taste of their mother's kitchen in Pike County, or Mingo County, carried north over the mountains and kept alive in apartment kitchens in Youngstown and Steubenville decades later. They knew things about dried beans and slow heat and patience that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 16. Stewed tomatoes and bread. A can of stewed tomatoes cost 39 cents in Flint, Michigan in 1985. A loaf of white bread was 69 cents. He opened the can, poured it into a small saucepan, added a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, a knob of butter, salt, black pepper, brought it to a simmer, and let it go for 10 minutes until the tomatoes had softened completely and the liquid had thickened and the whole thing smelled like something that had been tended to all afternoon, even though it had been on the stove for 10 minutes. Poured over 2 thick slices of white bread in a bowl. The bread absorbed everything, the tomato, the butter, the sweet acid liquid, and went soft and almost custardy underneath while the top kept a little texture. This was the simplest hot meal in the Rust Belt repertoire. 4 ingredients, under $1, and it still felt like someone had made you something on purpose, with attention, with care. That distinction mattered more than people understood. A man living alone in a cold apartment in Flint in January 1985 needed hot food that felt intentional, not heated, not opened, made. This was that somewhere around 1983, Campbell's Soup Company ran internal studies on the purchasing habits of men over 60 living alone in the Midwest. What they found, and what they quietly acted on, was this. Retired men on fixed incomes were still cooking from scratch at rates that alarmed the processed food industry. They were buying dry beans and cheap cuts and canned vegetables and making real food from real ingredients the way their mothers had taught them, because it was cheaper and more filling, and they knew how to do it and didn't need to be told otherwise. So, the industry moved. Campbell's increased its marketing spend targeting seniors by 40% between 1983 and 1986. Swanson's frozen dinner line added 8 new single-serving products aimed specifically at men living alone. The messaging was consistent across every campaign. Cooking for one is sad. Cooking for one is too much effort. You've worked hard enough. You've earned the right to stop. A Swanson frozen dinner in 1984 cost $1.89 and delivered approximately 680 milligrams of sodium and 310 calories. A pot of soup beans from scratch cost 40 cents and delivered complete protein, complex carbohydrates, folate, and iron. Enough food for 3 full meals. The industry knew this. They didn't care about the nutrition gap. They cared about the margin gap, and it worked. Scratch cooking rates among men over 60 in the industrial Midwest dropped measurably through the second half of the 1980s. Frozen dinner sales in Rust Belt zip codes rose 31% between 1985 and 1989. They didn't take the food away. They just convinced a generation of men who had built this country with their hands and their backs and their 30 years on the line that standing at a stove was beneath them now, that it was sad, that it was something people did when they had no other choice. That is not progress. That is the most cynical marketing campaign in American food history. Number 15. Pan-fried cube steak once a week. That was the rule, unspoken, never written down, just understood as part of the monthly arithmetic. Once a week he bought a piece of cube steak. A pound and a quarter ran about $1.20 in Youngstown in 1983. He dredged it heavily in flour seasoned with salt and pepper and laid it into a cast-iron pan in hot lard. The crust that formed in the first 2 minutes of contact was the whole point. Dark brown, almost crackling at the edges, sealing everything inside. When both sides were done, he pulled the steak and left it to rest while he made the gravy in the same pan without washing it, without even wiping it. Flour into the hot drippings, stirred constantly until it darkened one shade and smelled faintly of toasted wheat. Then milk poured in slowly, continuously stirred, salt and black pepper, a full 90 seconds until it thickened into something pale and glossy that poured slowly off the spoon, over the steak, over bread on the same plate, over everything. This was the one dinner of the week that felt like a Sunday, regardless of what day it fell on. The one night that had a centerpiece, something with weight and crust and the serious smell of meat cooked in hot fat. He ate it slowly. He'd earned that. 30 years on a factory floor in Youngstown earned a man the right to eat his cube steak slowly and without apology on whatever night of the week he'd chosen. Number 14. Homemade corned beef hash. Not from the can straight into the pan, though he kept those for emergency weeks at the end of a month when the math had stopped working. This was the version he made himself when he had a little more to work with. A can of corned beef broken apart with a fork into a bowl. Cold leftover boiled potatoes diced small, the ones from 2 nights ago that he'd deliberately made extra of because he knew this was coming. Half an onion chopped fine. Salt, pepper, a splash of Worcestershire sauce if the bottle wasn't empty mixed together, then into a cast-iron pan with a spoonful of lard, pressed flat with the back of a spatula, left completely alone on medium heat for 8 full minutes. That was the discipline the dish required, because the temptation was always to stir it, to check it, to move it around, and moving it ruined it. When the bottom had formed a hard, dark crust, he flipped it in sections, rough sections that didn't stay together perfectly, and left the other side alone for another 6 minutes. The outside went almost black in places. The inside stayed soft and yielding. 2 completely different textures from the same pan and the same ingredients. A can of corned beef cost 79 cents in Cleveland in 1984. The leftover potatoes cost nothing because he'd already paid for them. The whole pan fed him dinner and breakfast the next morning if he portioned it right. He always portioned it right. 30 years on a factory schedule had made him methodical about most things. Number 13. Split pea soup. The ham bone had been in his freezer since Christmas. It was February in Michigan, and he was finally ready for it. Stott peas cost 38 cents a pound in 1985. He rinsed them, added them to the pot with the bone, a diced onion, 2 carrots when he had them, salt, black pepper, and enough cold water to cover everything by 3 inches. Low heat. 3 hours. He didn't hover over it. Split peas didn't need managing. They needed time and heat, and they did the rest themselves, dissolving slowly into a thick, almost velvety soup the color of army canvas. By hour 2, the whole apartment held the smell of it, warm and deeply smoky from the bone and savory in a way that no powder, no packet, no bouillon cube had ever successfully replicated, regardless of what the soup aisle would like you to believe. The ham bone that had cost him nothing. Saved from a Christmas meal 2 months prior, wrapped in foil and kept patient in the freezer, gave the soup everything. Body. Smoke. Depth collagen from the joint that thickened the broth into something that coated the back of a spoon. 1 pot. Under $1 in ingredients. 6 full bowls of soup. In February, in Flint, with the heat turned low to keep the gas bill inside the budget, a pot of split pea soup on the stove was not just dinner. It was the warmest room in the apartment, and it had cost 38 cents to make it that way. Number 12. Fried egg sandwich. Eggs cost 79 cents a dozen in 1982 across the Rust Belt. That was 6.5 cents per egg. He cracked 2 into the cast iron pan on the back burner, into the residual grease from whatever he'd cooked the night before. Medium heat. Salt and pepper before the whites had fully set. He liked the yolk still running, not because anyone had told him that was the sophisticated preference, but because he had always liked it that way and had never needed a reason beyond that white bread. Butter on both slices pressed against the hot pan for 10 seconds to toast slightly. Eggs on one side, a thin spread of yellow mustard on the other, pressed together and eaten immediately. This was dinner. Not breakfast for dinner in the way brunch menus frame it now, with winking irony and $10 price tags. Just dinner. The meal that cost 13 cents, took 4 minutes, and required nothing from a man after whatever the day had taken from him. A retired man in Youngstown in 1984 on a $300 pension did not owe anyone an explanation for eating eggs at 6 in the evening. He made what he had. He made it the way he liked it. He sat down and ate it, and that was the complete and sufficient transaction. Number 11, macaroni and tomato sauce. No meat. No pretense of meat. Not a diminished version of something that was supposed to have a pound of ground beef in it. Just pasta and tomatoes, made correctly. Eaten without apology. Elbow macaroni, 49 cents a pound in Cleveland in 1984. A can of crushed tomatoes, 39 cents. A clove of garlic if he had it. Olive oil or butter. Salt, dried oregano, black pepper, and nothing else. He cooked the pasta in well-salted water, drained it, and made the sauce in the same pot. Tomatoes into the pot with fat and garlic, low heat. 15 minutes of simmering until the raw edge came off and the tomatoes sweetened and deepened slightly. Pasta back in, stirred together with a splash of pasta water to loosen it just enough. This was Tuesday. This was the middle of the month, when the numbers still added up, and he could eat simply without drama about it. A bowl of pasta and tomato sauce in a quiet apartment in Cleveland with the evening news on the television was not a sad meal. It was a complete one. It had starch and acid and fat and warmth, and it filled a man and cost 88 cents total for enough to eat twice. Grandma just called it pasta and sauce. That was exactly what it was, and nothing more was needed. In 2019, researchers at the University of Illinois published findings on the nutritional composition of traditional slow-cooked bone-in dishes. Oxtail, neck bones, chicken backs, beef feet, cuts that had fed working-class families in Gary and Pittsburgh and Detroit for decades at prices that never exceeded 50 cents a pound. What they found had been sitting in cast-iron pots on Rust Belt stoves since the 1950s. Slow-cooked collagen-rich cuts release compounds during long cooking that nutritional science has only recently begun to fully catalog. Glycine, proline, hydroxyproline, connective tissue proteins that support joint health, gut lining integrity, and the body's inflammatory response in ways that isolated protein supplements and center-of-the-plate muscle meats have never replicated. A bowl of properly made neckbone broth or oxtail stew delivers a nutritional profile that a boneless, skinless chicken breast, at 4 times the price per pound, simply cannot match. The men who bought these cuts at bottom-shelf prices in Rust Belt grocery stores weren't making a nutritional compromise. They were, without knowing the academic terminology, extracting exactly what their bodies needed from the cheapest cuts in the case. They knew things about low heat and bone and time that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. And while they were doing it, while retired workers in Youngstown and Flint and Gary were making 6-hour pots of neck bones for 29 cents a pound. The American food industry was constructing the low-fat, high-sodium, highly processed product line that would dominate the next 4 decades and produce the worst rates of chronic inflammation and metabolic disease in the developed world. The cheap food was the good food. It was always the cheap food. They just needed you not to know that. Number 8. Molasses and biscuit. When the barrel was almost empty, and the beans were running low, and Cookie had stretched everything as far as it would stretch, there were still biscuits, and there was still the molasses jug. He put them both on the tailgate and said nothing. The Cowboys split their biscuits, poured dark molasses into the center, and ate without complaint. This was not a meal that anyone chose. It was the meal at the end of the rope, when the rope had 2 more days left in it and the provisions didn't. But here is what nobody recorded in the trail diaries and nobody calculated at the time. 1 tablespoon of blackstrap molasses contains more iron than a 3-ounce serving of beef, more calcium than a 1/4 cup of milk, more potassium than a banana. The Cowboys eating molasses biscuits at the bottom of the supply barrel were eating one of the most nutrient-dense foods available to them. They didn't know that. Cookie didn't know that. But the body knew, and the body kept moving. 5 cents for a quart of molasses that lasted a week. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They replaced molasses with high-fructose corn syrup and called it progress. It was not progress. It was the removal of iron, calcium, and potassium from the American diet and the substitution of empty sweetness. That's what it was. Number 7. Burgoo. It came west with the drives that originated in Kentucky and Tennessee in the 1860s. Cowboys from those states brought the recipe in their memory the way they brought the knowledge of rivers and hills. Not written down, just known. Squirrel when a cowboy could catch one. Rabbit when Cookie spotted one near camp. Leftover beef gristle from whatever had been butchered. Corn, dried kernels or cornmeal. Beans already partially cooked. Wild greens if Cookie found them along the creek. Watercress, lamb's quarters, wild mustard. Everything in one pot. Cooked long and slow until it thickened to something that held its shape in a spoon. The consistency of river mud, the color of dark autumn, and the taste of every ingredient it had ever touched at once. Burgoo still exists in Kentucky today as a festival food, served at county fairs and political rallies and Derby Day parties. Nobody at those events connects their cup of burgoo to the cattle drives of the 1860s. Nobody tells that story anymore. Grandma just called it using what you had. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 6. Cowboy cookies, flour, lard, molasses, whatever dried fruit Cookie had at the bottom of the sack. Raisins, apricots, dried apple pieces. Sometimes oats when the Chuckwagon had been provisioned in a town that carried them. Mixed together into a stiff dough, dropped by the spoonful onto the Dutch oven lid, baked over low coals until they were set but not quite hard. By day 2 they were hard. That was fine. A cowboy riding night herd put 2 cookies in his coat pocket before mounting up, and sometime around 2 in the morning, somewhere between the first and second watch, he pulled one out and dropped it in his cold coffee and let it soften for 3 minutes. Then he ate it in the dark on horseback, alone, watching cattle that couldn't see him in the moonless Texas night. 2 cents a batch, enough for 12 men. Nobody called it comfort food in the 1870s because nobody had invented that phrase yet. But that is what it was, the food that reached past hunger into something lonelier and more human than hunger. The food that said, someone thought about you before you needed it. Number 5. Menudo. The vaqueros taught it to the Anglo cowboys on the shared drives along the Texas-Mexico border routes in the 1860s and 1870s. Mexican vaqueros, horsemen whose families had been working cattle in that country for 200 years, before the first Anglo rancher arrived. New things about using an animal completely that the cowboys from Tennessee and Missouri were only beginning to learn. Tripe, the honeycomb lining of the beef stomach, cleaned and cut into pieces, simmered with hominy corn, dried chili, onion, oregano, and garlic through the night. Cooked until the tripe softened from something almost impossible to chew into something yielding and deeply flavored. The hominy plump and starchy, the broth red and rich and smelling of every chili that had ever been dried in the Texas sun GQ, served it at sunrise. The whole crew ate from the same pot. Anglo and Mexican cowboys standing together at the tailgate of a chuckwagon in the 1870s, eating a dish that one culture had carried for centuries, and the other had just learned to love. Today, menudo is a Sunday morning staple across the Southwest. $12 a bowl in San Antonio, $14 in Albuquerque. The cowboys on the border drives got it free, cooked from the animal they were already herding. That is not a restaurant story. That is an American story that the restaurant took credit for. Number 4. Prickly pear syrup. Deep in the Sonoran desert reaches of the southern drives, the routes that pushed through West Texas and New Mexico toward Colorado and beyond, the land offered almost nothing. No trees. Minimal water. Dust that turned everything the same pale color. And then the prickly pear cactus, which grew in dense stands along the dry washes and canyon edges and asked nothing of anyone, and gave more than it was given credit for. Cookie learned it from Mexican and Comanche cooks who had been using prickly pear for generations. He harvested the deep magenta fruits with leather gloves, burned off the fine spines over the fire, cut them open, and boiled them down in the Dutch oven until the juice reduced to a thick, dark syrup the color of garnets held up to the sun, poured over hot biscuits. That was the whole meal. Warm bread and something sweet and wild and entirely free. The antioxidant content of prickly pear fruit rivals pomegranate by weight. The betulin pigments in the fruit are among the most potent anti-inflammatory compounds found in any food. The cowboys had no laboratory. They had a desert and a cook who paid attention. Free, medicinal, beautiful, and completely forgotten. Number 3. The cobbler ducky made this at the end of a good drive. Not during, not in the middle when morale was low and supplies were tight and the herd was restless and 3 men had already quit and gone back to Texas. At the end, when the Kansas railheads were close enough to smell, or to imagine smelling, and the crew had done what they set out to do, dried peaches reconstituted in water for an hour, or whatever wild berries Cookie had gathered along the last creek. Service berries, wild plums, sand cherries, poured into the Dutch oven with sugar and a little flour to thicken the juice. A biscuit dough laid over the top in rough torn pieces, not carefully arranged. Coals underneath the oven, coals piled on the lid, 25 minutes until the top was golden and the fruit beneath was bubbling up through the gaps. Kake set it on the tailgate and stepped back. The crew gathered around it the way men gather around a fire when the night is cold. Not rushing, not pushing, just drawing close to something warm. They called it the reward. Not metaphorically, literally, the reward for finishing. 5 to 6 cents of dried fruit and flour and sugar. The taste of arriving. Number 2. Nighthawk supper. This is the meal nobody talks about. Not in the history books, not in the Western films, not in the romanticized accounts of cattle drive life that turned cowboys into myths and myths into merchandise. This meal happened in the dark, alone, in silence, and it has never been given a name in any restaurant or any cookbook or any food television program, and it never will be. The night herders, the Nighthawks, 2 men at a time on rotating shifts from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, never got a hot meal. The fire was banked. Cookie was asleep. The camp was still. Before he turned in, Cookie left cold biscuits wrapped in cloth at the edge of the chuckwagon, and a cold pot of coffee beside them. No note, no instruction, just the knowledge that someone had thought of them before going to sleep. The nighthawk rode out in the dark, circling the herd slowly, keeping the cattle calm with low humming or a few lines of a hymn sung quietly. Not to perform, just to let the cattle know a human was nearby. Sometime around 2 in the morning he came back to the edge of camp, ate his cold biscuits in the dark, standing next to his horse, drank his cold coffee from the pot, and went back out. This was the loneliest meal in American food history. No warmth, no company, no comfort except the fact that someone left the biscuits there, and that was enough to mean something. No restaurant will ever serve this. No food magazine will ever photograph it. It belongs to the dark and the cattle and the men who circled them through the night on cold horses for $25 a month. Number 1. The last night meal. It had no name. That is the first thing to understand. Every other meal on the drive had a name. The stew, the beans, the biscuits, the cobbler. This meal had no name because it only happened once, and giving it a name would have made it ordinary, and it was never ordinary. The herd had been delivered. The cattle counted out at the Abilene or Dodge City stockyards. The trail boss paid, and the payment distributed to the crew. $25 a man for 3 months of riding. Some put it in their pocket and walked to town immediately. Cookie stayed at the wagon. He cooked everything that was left. Fresh beef, real beef, not the salt pork and gristle that had sustained them for 90 days, purchased from the first butcher in town with the trail boss's authorization. Real butter, bought at the general store. The last of the dried fruit, the last of the sugar, the sourdough one final time. A cobbler. A pot of the strongest coffee Cookie had made in 3 months. Every man came back. Some of them had been to the saloon already. Some of them had bought new boots or sent money home by telegram. But they all came back to the wagon. They sat on the ground around the fire, the same fire that had burned every night for 1,000 miles, and they ate until they couldn't move. Some trail diaries record men falling asleep right there on the ground beside the wagon, plates still in hand. Kopke cleaned up alone, the way he had cleaned up alone every night for 3 months. And in the morning the crew scattered, some to the next drive, some back to Texas, some to jobs in Kansas, some nobody ever heard from again. The wagon was restocked. The sourdough crock was refilled, and in 6 weeks it all started again from the Texas border, from the same corrals, with a new herd and some of the same men, and always, always Cookie at the tailgate at first light with biscuits. This is the meal that deserved a name. This is the meal that never got one. Closing soak those beans tonight the way Cookie soaked them before every drive. Bury something in the ash of a fire and pull it out in the morning and taste what patience makes. Drop a piece of dried fruit into rice and sweeten it with molasses and call it by its right name. Spotted pup. Not a recipe. A name that a tired man gave to something simple because it made him smile at the end of a hard day. The men who cooked these meals and the men who ate them were not eating poorly. They were not making do. They were eating with a precision and an intelligence and a knowledge of the land and the body that we have not replaced. We have only covered over with packaging and price tags and the comfortable lie that newer means better. Cookie earned $50 a month. He fed 12 men for 3 months across 1,000 miles on $40 worth of supplies. He kept them strong enough to do the hardest physical work in 19th century America. He did it without a single item from a grocery store, a single calorie label, or a single recommendation from anyone with a degree. The beef industry that replaced him built a billion-dollar infrastructure to sell you back the food he gave away for 3 cents a serving. They took the chili brick and put it in a can. They took the jerky and put it in a factory. They took the sourdough and put it in a plastic bag with a list of 22 ingredients, the first of which is not flour. That is not progress. That is the systematic erasure of a working man's genius. and the resale of that genius at a markup that would have made every trail boss from Abilene to San Antonio put his hand on his belt and say something unprintable. Cookie was right. Everything he knew was right. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made, or which one you want to try first. Because one of these belongs on your table this week. Just one. Start there.